C'è qualcuno là fuori? C'è qualcuno là fuori? Benvenuti al Christian Podcast.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of Christian Podcast, where hope is the future. Hope is the only future. And so excited. Today we have special guest, because I love special guests coming on the show. And today's guest is none other than, I'm not going to tell you until he comes up. He's going to come on the screen. We're going to talk super relevant, important stuff. He's coming on, so let's check it out. I'm so excited for this episode. Welcome.
Hey, what's up, Beto?
Hello. How are you, man?
Good. Let me check on my levels here. All right.
Oh, I think my sound's coming from the... Let me check this real quick.
Is it coming from the computer, not the mic? Let me double check my...
Yeah, mine's coming from...
Check.
Oh, there.
Check.
Okay.
Yeah, good? Okay.
Uh-huh.
Cool, man.
How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. How about you, man?
Good. You're an hour ahead, right?
Hour ahead. Yeah, you're Costa Mesa, right?
Yes. You know the area?
A bit. Are you at Rock Harbor? What is that? That's
No.
Costa Mesa.
Yeah. No, I used to go to Rock Harbor long ago. Now I'm at a church called Palm Harvest.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Yeah. I was at Rock Harbor pre-pandemic, maybe a year and a half ago.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I love it there. Was there for many years until I moved here, and now I started as a worship guy, and now I'm more like the media guy. Of course.
You're the most important person on staff then.
I wear many hats, man. All the hats.
Do you still lead worship?
We have a guy that leads worship, my friend, but I play sometimes, or things like that. It's been an interesting year because of COVID, so
Yeah.
I'm doing everything else.
Yeah.
So it's good.
Been doing a lot of podcasting too.
Yeah, I started last year.
Okay.
And well, I'm shifting something here in my screen. So I started, so this is my 25th episode or so it's fairly new. And
Okay.
I'm also launching a Spanish stream on a separate stream, but it's because I speak Spanish, so I'm like, why not, man? There's a lot of people I could talk to too. So
Sweet. You had Shane Blackshear on recently, right?
Who?
The seminary dropout.
Oh,
Shane?
yeah. Shane Blackshear.
But yeah, he's a good dude.
Yeah, I love him. Yeah, it was good. Man, I mean, what are the books for? I know you read, but every time I see people with so many books, I'm like, do you really go back to them, or what's with the collection?
Yeah, I spent. I actually got rid of a lot. I spent 12 years in school, so you tend to pick up a few books here and there. I try to keep books that are more for reference. Like a lot of these are commentaries, or I would say about half of the ones you see are more from like my PhD program stuff that I needed to work through and stuff. So,
wow,
yeah. I like to read, but it's not actually. If I showed you, it kind of ends right there, and it's got
Okay, looks good, man.
Yeah,
love it. I had Dan Koch. I don't know if you met him, but I had a Dan Koch on the show, and he had a background with like a massive library of books. It's like, it's a fake background, man. It's one of those like digital, whatever it's called.
Oh, like the green screen or something?
Yeah, but it was fun. So good to have you on the show, man. I have a list of things I almost like want to go through. I know
Yeah.
because of time, we probably won't be able to fit them all in there.
Mhm.
But this is something interesting, man. When I click on Instagram and I click on your name, this pops up. Christian sexuality is recommended. Like all kinds of topics on Christian sexuality are recommended to me. So
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, this guy, I mean, you're almost like epitomizing the conversation on Christian sexuality. So I'm like,
Yeah.
I want to talk to him. And I'll just give you a little bit of background of why this is interesting to me. I was reading this book by Leonard Sweet, probably a couple years ago. Super good book. It's called the Rings of Fire. And he kind of lays out just kind of like what the future is going to look like for Christians. And sexuality is one of the volcanoes that he names that. This is going to be a big topic. And one of the things I want to do with Christian podcasts, I want it to be a source of conversation for the church globally. And I think this conversation needs to be addressed. Human sexuality. And I think, specifically like on today's topic, you have a brand new book that I was listening to because it's my first time ever also that I had an Audible book. So it's interesting because now I wasn't reading it. I was listening to it. So for people that are unfamiliar with Audible, it's so good. It's just like listening to a podcast times 5. At least this one, it's an hour long podcast. But so good to like listen to it and like the ideas and thoughts. I'm like, oh, this is good. So I think I'm going to do more audio from now on. But anyways, that's my experience. And I feel like your book is entitled Embodied. So we want to talk about a little bit about that. But if you're ready, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure.
Unless you want to say something, before we start or whatever.
Yeah, no, not at all. Yeah, that book, Embodied, the subtitle is Transgender Identities, the Church, and What the Bible Has to Say. So the title, I like to give somewhat vague or provocative titles, and then the subtitles of my book typically gives more clarity on what the book's actually about. Because Embodied, that can mean many different things. In fact, if you go on Amazon, there's several books with that title that have nothing to do with the topic that I address. But yes, so I'm the president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality and Gender. So that's been my full-time job for over 4 years now, is helping Christian leaders and churches engage questions about faith, sexuality, and gender, specifically LGBTQ related questions, to engage those questions with theological faithfulness and courageous love. So grace and truth, theological depth, and also pastoral care, deep thinking, wide love. And I think in the past we've typically have done one of those things better than the other. Like we've had an airplane with one wing, and an airplane with one wing doesn't fly very far. And so I'm trying to help us understand that we need both wings. We need to hold to a robust, countercultural, counterintuitive Christian sexual ethic, and yet and also love people incredibly well who fall short of that standard, which includes every single one of us. So that's what I do full time. Before that, I was a college professor at a number of 3 different schools, Nottingham University, just a brief stint at Nottingham. It's so cool to say you taught at Nottingham that I always include that, even though I was only there for a temporary post. But then I taught at a conservative Baptist, well, the background was Baptist, a school called Cedarville University. And then I taught at Eternity Bible College, which was a Bible college started by Francis Chan, and ended there in 2016. And that's right when I started the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. So love to write, love to read, love life, love Jesus, hopefully, most of the time. Sometimes that's tough.
So good, man. Well, Preston Sprinkle, because I didn't say his name, is on the show today. He's got a brand new book, Embodied. What is the subtitle of the book? Sorry, I don't have it right in front of me.
No, it's fine. It's called Transgender Identities, the Church, and What the Bible Has to Say.
Transgender Identities, the Church, and What the Bible Has to Say. And you're the author of a previous book called A People to Be Loved, right?
Yep. Subtitle, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. So that book came out in 2015, and that dealt with kind of the LGB and the Bible. And then this book deals with the T of the acronym, which some people think they're kind of the same thing, but they're actually incredibly different. Like I had to do several years of research for each book, and there's about a 1% overlap in content between these two books. So the LGB and the T are really two different. There's some similarities, but they're very different conversations. And so, sometimes the acronym people throw around LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQ plus, LGBTQIA, and I think sometimes the acronym can be unhelpful in kind of in a really unhelpful way. We end up collapsing so many different kind of concepts together under one identity. And one of the things I want to do is kind of unravel this acronym a bit and ask more specific questions about sexuality and gender. Wow.
So good. Yeah, I think for me particularly, I'm kind of, I am new to this topic other than, I have a few friends who identify as either gay, LGBT or whatever of these cases. But to the actual conversation, I'm brand new, man. And even as I was listening to the book, some of the terms, I'm like, whoa, I could almost gotten lost into all the terminology. And you even said in your book, you want to help people to think theologically and scientifically about human nature. And then you said you went into a few scholarly disciplines to write the book. Things like neuroscience, theological anthropology, endocrinology, gender theory, and clinical psychology. And this is just a few of the stuff you talk about, right? And just from the get-go, it sounds like, man, what are these guys going to talk about? What is helpful to introduce people to this topic?
Yeah. And by the way, my internet can be a little glitchy, so I apologize if it's a little choppy here. One of the themes that run through the book is that this topic involves a lot of deep thinking about a lot of different academic disciplines, and that might appeal to kind of the nerds among us, the eggheads, the introverts who like to read books and get into theological debates maybe. And I think there's a place for that. And then this topic, you can't get around the fact that it involves a lot of theology, a lot of science, a lot of philosophy, all kinds of stuff that we need to think well about, but also our ultimate goal as Christians for thinking deeply about whatever is to love people better, right? Love people more precisely. So I've never understood this this dichotomy that some people assume, that exists between the heart and the mind. When I was in seminary, I would hear, if you study too much, you're gonna lose your heart for people. I'm like, in what world that God's created should it be true that the more you study his word, the less you're going to love people well, when the very word is about God's great love for people. So I'm not denying that that happens to some people, but I don't think it should. I don't think we should be scared of thinking too deeply. I think we should think very deeply and also love very widely. And so those are the two kind of underlying strands in the book. Is I interact with a lot of complex topics. Hopefully I do so in a way that's understandable. I try not to make it a scholarly book, but also, if you're listening to it, I weave stories in and out of the book so that we never lose sight of the fact that we are talking about a real diverse group of beautiful people created in God's image. So yeah, that's kind of the feel of the book.
Yeah. I love the part where this is about real people. This is not just a topic, this is people, behind all these concepts. There's actual people struggling with, or not struggling, but either or. But it's just real people living a real life, right? And what is, I mean, just I mean, I kind of know I listened to the book, but for people that just don't have any concept, like, why do we need to talk about transgender? How do we define who's a transgender? How is that different even from just, oh, I'm gay or homosexual? What's a little bit of going into the terms, like, why transgender?
Yeah. So those are two really important questions. Why should we address this topic? Why should Christians think about it? And then what is it we're even kind of thinking about? The first one, why we should think about it, partly because it's kind of everywhere in society right now. So, I mean, there's lots of questions being raised from politics to in broader culture, in entertainment and music. And also we have many more people in our churches who might be wrestling with their own gender identity. And we can maybe define that in a second. A lot of people wrestle with who they are, and they don't feel really safe to wrestle out loud or to get help from the church. So even though, yes, it's a small percentage of the human population that would identify as trans, that should never discourage Christians from thinking about it. I mean, again, we follow a savior who left the 99 to pursue the one, who had a special heart for those who are marginalized, those who were othered, those who were outcasted by society, especially religious, the religious among us. So I do think the trans population does fit that kind of profile. I think if Jesus were here today, he would have more trans friends, not fewer trans friends. So, but yeah, the trans conversation. So you have trans people that Christians should reach out, get to know, obviously. But also the trans conversation raises some fundamental questions about human nature that are pertinent to everybody, really. I mean, you could take, for instance, the whole question of trans people in sports. This is a particularly hot button issue. Should a biological male who identifies as female play in typically female only sports? And that raises all kinds. Maybe people listening are going to want to jump in with a yes or no, or well, hold on a second. How well do you understand human nature and biology and testosterone and prenatal hormone exposure in the womb? And if you don't know what half the stuff means, then we need to understand these things so we can have a more responsible and thoughtful answer to this question. What does it mean to be male and female? How much overlap is there? How much difference is there? What does woman mean? No, so English is your second language, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the terms man and woman, I mean, these are going to be probably the first maybe 50 English words you're being exposed to. These are really basic English terms, and yet we live in a society today where I think people wouldn't even know how to define that. For instance, is Kamala Harris, Kamala, I think.
My pastor says Camila, but
Camila.
I say it's not Camila, man. It's Kamala.
Kamala. I'm going to stick with Kamala. Is Kamala the first female vice president in America because she is, or because she identifies as a female? Like, is female primarily an identity that somebody chooses for themselves, or is it an objective state of existence that is determined for you apart from your subjective choice? Like, those are, I think that's a big debate right now in society. So again, I don't want to get too far off the rails here, but we're dealing, the trans conversation has sort of unearthed a lot of other questions about what it even means to be human. So that's point number one. I think this conversation is important for anybody, any Christian in particular, to interact with. What does it mean to be trans? Well, that's chapter, 2 or 3 of my book, where I spend a whole chapter kind of looking at the diversity of trans. Mark Yarhouse is a Christian psychologist, and he likes to say, if you've met one transgender person, you've met one transgender person. Like, there's such a wide diversity of what it even means to be trans. And let me just give you 2 polar ends of that spectrum of perspectives. On one polar end, somebody, some people say you need to be diagnosed with a psychological condition called gender dysphoria. Like, this is, if you've been clinically diagnosed with gender dysphoria, then you are truly trans. You're the real trans person. On the other side of the spectrum, somebody might say, well, I don't need some medical professional gatekeeper to tell me I'm trans. If I say I'm trans, then I'm trans. And so they might, on this other end of the spectrum, they kind of push back on this medical criteria for determining whether you're trans or not. And that's just with trans. I mean, there's all kinds of other categories underneath trans, like non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, and many others, demigender and so on, that I think a lot of people don't even know what these terms even mean. So yeah, I honestly, I can't even give a short answer to what it means to be trans. All I can do is alert you and the audience to the fact that that's a huge debate right now on what it even means to be trans. So yeah, we're jumping right into it, aren't we?
We are, man. I think it's super helpful that that phrase you said, when you met one trans people, you've met one trans people, right? Like you can't really generalize, okay, this is what it is. That's one case, and the next case might look totally different. I think also another really helpful conversation to kind of like understand this better is the difference. And I mean, you mentioned it in the audiobook. You mentioned it used to be so easy to say, man, you have a penis, you have a vagina, right? You're a boy or you're a girl. Like your physical sexuality represented your identity, right? Your sexual identity, but now, or your gender identity. And I think now there's, at least from society, there's a difference between the two, right? I mean, you could be born male. That doesn't necessarily mean your gender is male. Now, some people might say, what? Of course it is, right? But I mean, is this a social construct? Is this like what you're saying at the beginning? Society right now is kind of like we're figuring out who we are. Is this science? Is this one side of the, are we on the one side of the spectrum, or this other side of the spectrum is almost like the pendulum swinging? Yeah. Why do we have this, right? Why do we have this difference between sex and gender? What is that difference?
Well, that's it's important to recognize exactly that for many parts of society, people make a distinction between sex and gender. So sex is your biological sex, whether you're male or female. And that's something, except for the small percentage of people that might have a intersex condition where there's some ambiguity in their biological sex. 99.99% of people are either male or female. That's just a biological fact. In fact, 100 years after you're dead, people can dig up your bones and they can still tell whether you are male or female. This is etched into the basic coding of what it means to be human. That's sex. Now, up until the 1970s, people would also say gender to refer to that reality. Well, since then, in most academic circles, but even now, it's widespread in culture to make a distinction between sex and gender. Sex, again, is your biological sex. Gender is, some people define it as your psychological or cultural aspects of being male or female. So, for instance, your psychological aspects, your gender identity is kind of your internal sense of who you are. Now that, again, all I'm doing is defining how these words are used. I'm not saying these are really helpful concepts. I'm just saying these are the concepts that most people are wrestling with. So your gender identity, your internal sense of who you are. And then you have this other thing called like gender roles, like your expectation. Like if you're a male, there's certain societal expectations of how you should act. So for instance, in American culture, if you are a man and you are married to a woman, society would sort of expect you to be the breadwinner, to go to work, and If you were a stay-at-home dad, and you raised the kids and your wife was off at work, many people in society would be they would not, like, that wouldn't be the expectation. People, like, that would be a little atypical. Again, I'm not saying it's wrong or not. I'm not even saying people would say it's wrong. I'm just saying that'd be a little bit like, oh, whoa, that's not what I would expect when I met a husband and wife. So you have these concepts like masculinity and femininity, these sort of cultural assumptions about what it means for a man and woman to exist in society. Well, that's kind of these gender roles, And so when people say that gender is a social construct, and some people kind of don't like that phrase, but there's a good deal of truth to that. Like, the fact that we would, as a society, have certain assumptions about what it means to be masculine or feminine, that is by definition constructed partly by society. So social construct. Or the classic example is, the colors pink and blue. If I were to ask my audience, is pink a feminine color or masculine color? Everybody's going to say, well, pink is a feminine color.
That's why we have gender reveals.
What's that?
We have gender reveals, pink
gender
and blue.
Reveals, exactly, yeah. But that is the essence of a social construct, because 100 years ago, some people don't know this, pink was considered masculine and blue was feminine. If you had a pink 100 years ago, if you had a daughter, you would put her in a blue, maybe dress or something, and if you had a son, pink was the masculine color. That's a kind of an obvious example that these things that we associate with femininity and masculinity are in part constructed or influenced by society. So all that to say, when you enter into the trans conversation, understanding the difference between sex and gender are really important. So when people ask the question, how many genders are there? And my audience right now, as I ask that question, don't answer it. You cannot answer it until you ask a question. Your question should be, what do you mean by gender? Because if gender is defined as your internal sense of self, how many internal senses of self are there in the world? 7 billion? I don't know. I mean, it's like when people are defining gender in such, I would say, subjective and kind of nebulous ways, and I'm not saying that's wrong or right, I'm just saying that is what it is, that can add confusion to the conversation when other people are thinking sex when they hear gender, and then what do you mean there's all these genders? There's only two. It's like, well, there's two sexes, but how many genders are there? Well, we got to ask the question, what do you mean by gender? Because right now that term is used 11 different ways by 10 different people.
Mm-hmm. And I think the point is not really to understand why, even though, I mean, that you talk about ontological and just a bunch of stuff, right? Psychological and but it's just the reality today, right? On another episode, maybe we'll talk about maybe the whys or where is that coming from or what caused that. It's going to be super hard, and that's a whole topic in itself. But I think that's really helpful to understand that in this cultural moment, there is a distinction, whether we see it or not. And whether, right, I think that's super helpful when you say, what is gender? That should be, what do you mean when you say gender, right? And for example, I mean, it's we're going to see it more and more, right? Mm-hmm. But when we have to, like, push the dot of we're male or female on non-binary or other or don't want to identify, right? And I mean, just culture itself, it's creating these spaces, maybe for inclusion, maybe for saying, there's other people that don't identify or can be categorized under these. Let's create this. So that's just the reality. Why are you, what do you say to people that maybe question you, like, what does this, I mean, and this is because I've heard it on your book, right? But that's the reason why I know I can say this, but why is this man who is, I even forgot the word for not homosexual.
Trans or
no, like the word for a guy that likes a woman.
Heterosexual.
Heterosexual. Yeah. See, haven't even used that word in so long.
Yeah, right.
Why is this here like heterosexual man talking about transgenderism, and even in your previous book, talking about this homosexuality? What is how do you respond? I mean, or have you faced that type of critic?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, especially in this day and age, it's kind of like a white man talking about race, well, in this day and age, being a white straight male talking about anything, people say you need to sit down. You've been talking too long for centuries. And, and I very much resonate with that concern. And I faced that when I wrote my book on homosexuality, on the Bible and homosexuality. People were, raising a question: should a straight person be even talking about this? And I guess my response is, first of all, I do. If I put myself in the shoes of somebody who is LGB or T, I think I would be nervous, whenever a non-LGBT person talks about this, because they obviously have a lack of knowledge in terms of what it's like to be LGBT. They lack the lived experience. And so, and oftentimes many straight people have gone about this conversation in a way that has been very dehumanizing, has been very detached. And so the very fact that I'm writing on this topic could be immediately triggering to some people. And I actually, I understand where that can come from. So this is why I'm really clear up front. When I'm writing on this topic, I'm not writing a memoir. I'm not going to tell you, here's what it's like to be gay or lesbian, or I'm not even really primarily writing to, well, no, I almost said like, I'm not writing to help LGBT people, but I actually am. I'm not writing to tell them what it's like to be LGBT is what I wanted to say. Obviously, I'm not writing a memoir. Like, there's plenty of memoirs out there too. I will say though, simply being gay or lesbian doesn't automatically make you an expert in a biblical theology of sex. It doesn't make you an expert in understanding the ethics of Christian sexual ethics. It doesn't make you an expert in church history and how the church has handled this conversation. It doesn't, being trans doesn't automatically make you an expert in theological anthropology or neuroscience or psychology. The lived experience, I think, is incredibly helpful and absolutely needed. And the lived experience is something we cannot get our arms around. We can't fully understand this topic without some contribution from lived experience, but simply having a lived experience doesn't make you an expert in some of the concepts that this conversation entails. So that's my contribution. Is not a memoir. My contribution is I have thought through these concepts while dialoguing and listening to many, many LGBT people. So I have tried to put relational skin on the concepts, but yeah, I hopefully I've tried to understand and articulate the concepts in a way that's helpful for anybody thinking about this question. And lastly, I mean, I've always made it clear my primary audience is Christian leaders, most of whom are not going to be gay, lesbian, or trans or bisexual. And yet they are shepherding and leading and talking to and discipling LGBT people. So in a sense, I'm helping fellow leaders to do that better. And oftentimes they might, unfortunately, they might not listen to somebody who's trans, Wow. So I do have an in, I guess, with some people that my gay and lesbian brothers and sisters might not get the ear of, So I hope does that make sense?
Yeah, makes total sense, man. Hopefully for people listening too, I know this is a complex topic. I guess the most helpful thing is don't keep out of sight that there's people, right? We're talking about real people. So And I think another really helpful thing is that at this stage, this day and age, everybody has probably one or two friends or relatives or someone that identifies as, whichever in the spectrum of LGBTQ plus or whatever there is, right, in terms of gender or identifying yourself sexually. We all have somebody, right? Everybody has somebody in their life. I don't know. It's kind of like a generalization and assumption, but I think it's pretty safe to say.
Yeah.
And I think at least I'm approaching it from that point of view. When I talk about this, I know I have people in my life that I love, that I would love to have at least the conversation, right? Instead of and I think this comes also to the point of what do Christians think, or what does the Bible say about this type of things, right? And when you start talking about those topics, when you start being a leader of Christian leaders, I think these questions start to rise up. Well, for some people it might be, well, it's so clear in the Bible, right? I mean, Adam and Eve, or not Adam and Steve, or things like that. Or Romans, or First Corinthians, and I think yes, it's there, but I think it's, if we just say it's there and we don't open up to at least the conversation and the possibility to have empathy and try to understand why are people in this situation, then we're not going to be helpful, I'd say, right? And we'd become just, maybe a source of condemnation rather than a source of hope for people. What is your experience as it relates to that question of what does the Bible say about transgender, or about like this topics of sexuality?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I love your perspective. Like, I just personally, I have zero interest in just simply reinforcing people's presuppositions. I want to challenge people to think. So, even if I think somebody might have the quote unquote correct view on this matter, if they know what they believe but don't know why they believe it, or if they're using bad arguments or misquoting passages, or just if they don't understand the complexity of the theological conversation, then I'm not interested in just feeding their ignorance. Like, I want people to think deeply so that they can love more widely about this topic. And some of the most quote unquote biblically minded people are scared of actually studying the Bible for fear of the Bible might actually correct their presuppositions. And I've gotten in trouble with that quite a bit when I start challenging the why people believe what they believe. Even if I think their conclusions might be generally correct, I just, are those conclusions based on a robust, thoughtful, humble study of God's word, or is it just absorbed from their Christian subculture? I think that's an important question to ask. What does the Bible say about the trans conversation? Well, that's my basically my whole book, but in particular, I do spend a few chapters on the Bible. And some people think the Bible doesn't say anything. And if we were looking for a verse that addresses, for instance, gender dysphoria, or even like trans identities head on, we're not going to find that verse. But we find many verses and themes in Scripture that do talk about human nature, and do talk about our bodies, and do talk about our sexed identities. So probably the most significant one is Genesis 1:27, where it says that God created us in his image, male and female, he created them. And you see a correlation between how we bear God's image, and our image-bearing status is correlated with not just our bodies, but our sexed bodies, male and female. In Genesis 1:27 is clearly talking about biological sex, not the modern day concept of gender or gender identity. And throughout Scripture, we see a very high view of our sexed bodies in determining human identity. Like, I do think God determines whether we are male or female based on our biological sex. and yet in a fallen world, some people experience incongruence or severe incongruence between their internal sense of who they are and their biological sex, and that's where the pastoral question kind of comes up. But yeah, I do think that when we look at the question of incongruence, if there is this tension between somebody's internal sense of who they are and their biological sex, I will say, and then let me just little footnote. I mean, it took me 5 years of research and a whole 250-page book to kind of support what I'm about to say. So I don't want people to, I really want to push people to think more deeply about this. But if there is an incongruence between your biological sex and internal sense of who you are, I do think the biological sex wins out. Like, I do think that determines who we are, even if our psychology doesn't resonate with that. So, that's half of what the Bible says. The other half is the Bible speaks very loudly and boldly and confrontationally about loving people who have been marginalized by religion, who have been pushed to the margins by society, and for sure trans people would fit that category in terms of somebody, a group of people who have been marginalized, shunned, shamed, mistreated by the church. And sometimes our culture wars don't really help. So I know I don't even know where we're at with the whole, Equality Act or whatever, where they're trying to, I don't know if I want to get into that, but people know what I'm talking about. Like, I think when Christians get embroiled over these political debates, I think we oftentimes lose our affections to loving the actual people that we're ultimately talking about. So, again, the Bible talks a lot about that kind of posture.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, at the risk of being canceled at some point, I want to tell a story, and this is me in my early teens or almost like pre-teens in Mexico. I mean, I remember there's this spot in the city that was used to be known as the, if you want to find kind of like this people that offer their bodies, but is not really a woman. It's a guy dressed as a woman, right? Or a man who believes he's a woman. Mm-hmm. There was like this specific area where they would be. And I remember, for whatever reason, I guess, I don't know, it was culturally, it was way different. It's a different country. Many years ago, I'm going to be 40 this year. So that's like 30 years ago or so. I remember people would drive by that place and mock, the women that were there, throw all kinds of slurs or, just all kinds of ugly words or whatever, right? Just making fun of them. And, I guess as I think back a little bit about this conversation we're having right now, and when we were actually in society 30 years ago, like doing this type of things, I do realize, man, we are broken, right? How broken are we that at least in that era, we used to think, oh, it's okay to do this, right? It's okay to mock people for doing things that just seem outrageous to us, right? Or weird or whatever it might be. And now I think I love what you're saying about, yes, scripture says this thing, but it also says to love the marginalized, to love the outcast. Mm-hmm. What a different approach it would have been, at least for me, right? If instead of mocking people, you offer something positive, right? Or just start to try to be at least helpful in the conversation. I don't know if at 13 I could have been very conversational, but I think it's just the attitude of the heart, that now I feel like something's shifted or changed in me, where I feel like, man, that's just so wrong. Even if you disagree with how people live their lives, it's like, can we at least talk about it, right? Can we at least try to find out why they have this? I guess the correct word or the psychological word is gender dysphoria, right? And and understand that there might be something more psychologically going on in their minds than just the physical sex, right? And if we don't approach this with love first, I think we're gonna be lost. And I think you said it well in your book. And I don't have pages because I was just listening to it, but somewhere in that you said, if we get the Bible right and love wrong, we are wrong.
Yeah.
And I would love to say, or I guess as you said that phrase, I said, wow, it's almost like, can I say, if we get the Bible right and love wrong, we're not getting the Bible right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that mocking point, yeah, it's I've never met anybody who was kind of mocked into the kingdom of God. Like they were mocked so hard and then they said, wow, I really want to join the religion that this mocker is, a part of. Like I've never met that person. But my Bible says in Romans 2:4 that it's the kindness of God that leads to repentance. And so if we truly want people to repent, then we should be all the more kind. There should be no place for mocking. And oftentimes when, going back to your illustration with that scenario, like you see this, this group of people, living in debauchery or, oppression or, who, we have to ask the question, how do they get there? What? Like if you actually sat down and listened to one of those person's stories for an hour, what do you think that story would look like? I doubt they had, just an amazing upbringing, all this, great loving parents and then they just woke up one day and decided to go sell themselves on the streets. Like that rarely is the case. Like usually there's a lot of pain and oppression and sometimes abuse or stuff that, if anybody went through, would probably end up in the same place. So it really is the epitome of being a judgmental Pharisee, to simply show up and mock them and drive off. And that what's hard is, as much to bring it back to politics, like I do see a growing interest among Christians in the kind of political wars in our country. And whichever side you are on, if you give your allegiance to one side or the other, or listen to this political commentator or that political commentator, typically they stoke these fires in our souls that want to mock and be outraged and accuse the other person. And we, again, when we have that posture, when we get sucked into these political wars, then I think we end up losing the Christ-like affections that we're supposed to have towards people who are often caught in the middle of these political wars. And that's it's, as a church, we've got a golden opportunity right now to do it differently, to embody both the truth and grace of Jesus and not get sucked into the polarized culture that we are living in right now.
Yes, I love that, man. I think I feel like I almost want to tell some of my friends, who are super conservative. I'm like, man, I almost feel like I agree with your conservative side, but your approach, man, it's not gonna invite any conversation. It's gonna repel people. It doesn't have anything. It doesn't have any grace. It's not showing any kindness. It's not bringing anything helpful to the conversation. It's just almost just like a blunt, I disagree, right? And I feel like to tell some of those conservative people maybe listening, I don't even know if there's that much of a conservative. I would assume, because there's people listening around the world. But if you're conservative, we're not saying we either agree or disagree. I think this is we're just trying to be helpful with even if we agree. If you just have a standpoint where you say everybody else is wrong, that's not gonna bring about a solution to any issue, whatever the issue might be. But in this case, I think even if you have this stance that, no, I believe the Bible is right in terms of sexuality and like all this, like almost like moral dilemma, I think it's more helpful to approach it with a with a humble heart, right? With an openness, like you said, to think more widely, because ultimately love wins, right? Yeah. It's how you bring people into the kingdom. I think you said it. Let me see if I can find it here. Yeah,
as you're looking, I want to really quick clarify that. Yeah, I would say my values in terms of even politics and society would definitely lean more conservative. My main concern is when we give more allegiance or affection to a particular political tribe. Not that we can't vote a certain way or even resonate maybe with the values of one side or the other, but in this day and age, both sides that are fighting this culture war are producing so much outrage in people's hearts, and that's where the danger lies. I think Christians should have a healthy, measured, humble, forthright response to unbiblical worldviews that are trickling down and invading the church. Absolutely, we should pay attention to stuff going on and deconstruct and respond, but do so with a posture that's not just outraged, but is embodying the same kindness of God that leads to repentance. So, sorry, you were finding a quote.
I found it, man. It says, "The greatest apologetic for truth is love." I love that, man. And this is my first Audible book that I listened to. So it's different because normally I'm highlighting things and I just go back to the pages. But in this case, I got to listen and then I got to type this because it's so good. The greatest, listen to it again and almost pause and listen to that. The greatest apologetic for truth is love, right? And I think that's embodied in how Jesus lived. I mean, Jesus is the perfect example of the greatest apologetics of truth, and he lived a life of love. I want to talk about a little bit of the parenting side or the parenting conversation of this topic, because I mean, you talk about this again. I almost got a little bit. There's so much terminology, but there's one where you said, I think it's called CTR or CHT. CHT. Can you say what is CHT, and why is there this rising in teenagers who are trying to undergo a transformation of their bodies?
So CHT stands for cross-sex hormone therapy, which is one of the stages of transitioning. And when we talk about transitioning, from one biological sex to be more precise, I would say to the appearance of the other biological sex, because you can't, at least right now, we don't have the technology to truly change biological sexes. I mean, our biological sex is etched into the code of every single cell in our body. So we can't right now, maybe in the future, change that, but we can change from one appearance to the other. And CHT, cross-sex hormone therapy, is one significant way to do that. So if you're a biological male, you have much higher levels of testosterone and lower levels of estrogen, though you do have some estrogen than females. But we can alter that. We can reduce your testosterone and elevate your estrogen, and that will have major effects on your body. It will give you a more feminizing appearance. And same thing for biological females taking testosterone. Now, and that's a whole other conversation, whether this is helpful or good or ethical and all that. Where I am deeply concerned is, and I have a whole chapter in the book on this, is younger teenagers going through this kind of medicalization, because younger teenagers are younger teenagers. Our brains aren't fully developed until we're 24, 25 years old. Teenagers are going through all kinds of things, especially figuring out who they are and identity crises sometimes. We know that teenagers today have much, much higher levels of anxiety, depression, suicidality, mental health concerns. And so to take a teenager and perform irreversible medicalization on them I'm deeply concerned about that, especially when the medicalization does seem to be ideologically driven. What I mean by that is there is this, I would say, very unscientific assumption that, if a 9-year-old or 12-year-old or 15-year-old says they're trans, then that's who they are. That's who they always will be. This is innate. This is etched into the fabric of their humanity. And it's like, no, it's not. It's just not. Like, according to all the scientific studies done, 61 to 88% of children with gender dysphoria, it ends up going away after puberty. And we know that gender dysphoria is hard to pin down. It can come in waves. It can come, it can go. And so no, identifying as trans is not like some innate, never-ending identity that will always be there. So it just doesn't make any, not just biblical sense. I mean, I'm not even getting into the Bible yet, but I mean, it doesn't make any scientific or even human sense to permanently medicalize a teenager that will have irreversible effects on them. If you're on cross-sex hormones for more than 18 months, typically you're infertile for life. So if you end up growing out of that identity, or maybe that's changing that identity and realizing, no, I'm not trans, I'm actually non-trans, and yeah, I do want to get married, I do want to have kids. Well, that decision has been taken from you by a medical professional who has been, I would say, for ideological interests, not because the science says no, every single teenager who identifies as trans who wants hormones should go on hormones. So yeah, it's a huge debate. And when I say debate, it's debated among very liberal, non-Christian psychologists and medical professionals who are like, this is not okay. It's like people who are totally fine with an adult saying, I want to transition, it's like, it's free country, do what you want. But 15-year-olds don't have the ability to make this kind of irreversible decision. So yeah, I think parents need to be very aware that this is a huge thing going on in society right now, especially if you are a parent of young teens who, I mean, even if you're like, well, my kid's not trans, well, not yet. I mean, there's been a 5,000% increase among female teenagers in the United Kingdom coming out as trans, like almost overnight, like with no prior history of gender dysphoria. So even if you think your kid, oh, they're not gender dysphoric, they act like a boy, they act like a girl, and they are a boy or girl. Anything can happen when they become a teenager. So being aware is the best way to be able to shepherd your kids well. If they come out as trans, or if their friends do, and they start asking questions about this, because this is serious stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, you say it's gender ideology. To me, it's super interesting because I'm a communications guy, and sometimes I feel like, okay, it's almost like this question of what comes first, the egg or the chicken. So when I look at culture, and when I look at Disney Plus or Netflix and things like this, like movies we watch, and it starts showcasing two women kissing or things like that, right? Where I'm like, okay, is that creating culture, or is that just portraying what our society looks like right now? Right? So in a sense, I feel like, I don't know, or maybe it's both. Maybe it's a little bit of, no, at the same time that it's showcasing it, it's almost like opening up the possibility for people to think about, oh, maybe I can do the same, right? Maybe I can, if I have this dysphoria, maybe I should lean more into that. I don't know. I feel like almost like when, if you have choices, you're going to take them, right?
I would say that, yeah, with teenagers today, and this is, this is politically incorrect, maybe, but not even politically incorrect. It's disputed, but everything in this conversation is disputed. So I just talk about whatever and let the chips fall where they may. It's a big, touchy suggestion to say that culture might play some role in influencing somebody's either gender identity or sexual identity. Well, guess what? Nature and nurture are very blurry. Our sexuality is very complicated. Gender identity is very, very complicated. There's debates about what that even is. So yes, of course, there's the possibility, I'll just leave it at that, that culture is on some level influencing people's sexual exploration and or sexual or gender identity. When it comes to gender identity, I would say without a doubt with younger kids, culture is playing a role. I'm not saying that, biological, psychological tendencies aren't there as well, but I think culture is for sure playing a role. This is why I think we have such a rise in even bisexual identities. Every other teenage girl today, I feel like, I think statistically it's very unprecedented number of teenage females who identify as bisexual or pansexual, which is largely the same thing. It just comes with a different ideology on what it means to be human. And again, going back to the trans identity, what does it mean to be trans? It could be anything from like, I'm a girl and I want to cut my hair short and color it blue, and I don't feel very feminine, to I have severe gender dysphoria and I can't leave the house, because I feel like I'm inside somebody else's body. Like there's, again, it could be, trans covers all that stuff. So, there's all kinds of different reasons why somebody might explore bisexuality, especially in a culture that not only is okay with it, but might even encourage it, or might even interpret. Sometimes emotional feelings are overinterpreted. So like in some contexts today, if you're a female and have some kind of admiration of another female, our culture will push you to interpret those feelings sexually, even though
wow,
we could be straight as an arrow and still look at a guy with a good body and say, dang, I wish I had those abs. That doesn't mean we're attracted to him sexually. It just means that like you could admire somebody's body or even be jealous of somebody's body or even have a non-sexual emotional attachment to another human. And in this day and age, it's like the only category that exists, or the main category is a sexual category. So I think teenagers are for sure aren't even being helped in how to interpret their own emotional responses. So yeah, I think culture is playing a role.
Yeah, and just for Preston, for people that are listening, and just kind of like incentivize them to get the book, to read the book. I love that there's this part in the book where you talk about Mr. KD. Man, I was listening to it, and you talk about like this KD falling in love, or not really falling in love, but having like this really good friend, and who he said, oh man, this guy, I love him almost more than I love women. And he happened to be in the Bible, and some people utilizing this passage to say, man, you see, it's right there, right? No, we can love another guy. And well, just go check it out, guys, because it's a tremendous book on the conversation, the whole conversation about gender identity, the whole conversation about what does it mean to be transgender, which it really comes down to when there's a transgender, that's just one transgender, right? It can be more than that, but it's such a helpful book and conversation for something that, like Preston's saying, we need to talk about it. We need to be aware. We need to, even somewhere in the book, you mentioned that I think Iran is the country with more transition operations. So, this is a global phenomenon in a sense. And I think as Christians, I rather face like full on the subjects and say, okay, let's talk about it, rather than trying to catch up with culture and say, no, culture is scary. Let's not talk about it. We got to do it right now. So it's a super helpful resource. There's so much scientific research, I would say, into like even the terminology. There's data, there's statistics, super informational. But I think after all, it also comes down to a heart issue. How are we going to respond as Christians? And even I don't even want you to answer these questions. I just want to say that it's in the book. For example, of course, if you're going to talk about transgender from almost like a biblical scholar, one of the questions is, should a Christian convert, or what did you call it? Transition, right? Should a Christian transition, to your gender identity? I don't want you to answer it, man, because I want people really to wrestle with it and to go to the book maybe as a resource. But maybe to wrap it up, man, how do you want to end? Like, what's a helpful, what's helpful to wrap up this conversation? What?
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, I think it's just what you've been talking about. Like, I do think all Christians in this day and age need to think, need to set aside some time in your life to think better about this topic, and don't just rely on your favorite political pundit to be the expert in your life. And I honestly, one of the things I hate doing is promoting my own stuff, right?
But it's good.
There's too much of that going on, so I don't want to do that. I will say I wrote this book because I wasn't satisfied with the other books out there. There's books out there that contribute to the conversation in helpful ways. There were certain questions that I felt like still needed to be asked and answered. And I think the Bible needs to be thought through more critically. So, I would encourage you to read my book, but not because it's my book, but because I do think it's a helpful overview of the conversation. But if you're like, no, I want to read a different book, then read a different book. Like go just make sure you engage this conversation thoughtfully so that you can love people better. In 2021, I don't think silence is an option for any thinking Christian who wants to be a helpful discipler, whether you're discipling your kids, people at church, whether you're a leader, a youth pastor, whatever. Like you cannot. Maybe 5 years ago you can get by and ignore this conversation, but I would say this might be slightly too strong, but probably not. I think it's a little irresponsible, really, to try to disciple people well in the West, in America, without engaging this conversation to some extent, because this is something that most younger people, especially, are really thinking through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. A lot of young people are thinking through, and I think part of this, just kind of to end on this, part of my goal with Christian Podcast is really to be a resource almost for like the global South. And I was talking a little bit about this topic with Dan Koch, where we were saying how, long story, but basically the Western world still holds like the reins on the power and the resources when it comes to Christianity and conversation, even though the global South has more Christians now in the world, right? Yeah, so I feel like I almost like want to bridge the two, me with my Mexican background, coming from Latin America, and I know that a lot of what happens in America, or even in America, Europe, England, a lot of what happens here replicates, maybe because of its cultural implications, right? With movies and TV shows or whatever, it replicates in the world. So even as when I look at like my Facebook page and I see, like women rising and saying, oh, we want, this is in Mexico, right? Women, like today or like this week, I think it's maybe today, but there's a march of women in the capital of Mexico who are saying, hey, we want to be treated differently. I think we deserve, almost like, kind of like what happened here in the US, a few years ago, right? Why are we making less money than a man, right? If we put the same effort, so I feel like a lot of what happens here replicates in the world. So I feel like this is such a helpful conversation, because I know it might take a couple of years, but at some point in Latin America, in the global South, we're going to be asking the question, oh man, how do I love well a trans person, right? Or how do I love well a LGBTQ? So I think not only is this a great resource for the Western world, I think it's a great resource for the global church in engaging in this conversation and saying, man, we gotta maybe do a better job at understanding what the issue is and understanding that there's people behind it. And ultimately, if we're Christians, I think to understand that, well, I don't know if we can understand it because it comes from the heart, but it's transformational when we really love people. And I think there's also that sense of where we're also discipling people. So how can we do that lovingly and do it well and do it with from a standpoint of empathy? So I guess that's my conclusion. Do you want to say anything else? Do you want to point people to where they can get the book or your website or your resources? Because I know you also have a podcast, which is phenomenal. So I also have it on christianpodcast.com if people want to find it. There's that, but I want to point people to.
So I run a ministry called the Center for Faith, Sexuality and Gender. So centerforfaith.com. And we do have resources in Spanish. The e-resources they can download at centerforfaith.com. And my podcast, Theology in the Raw, twice a week, free podcast. We talk a lot about lots of things, but sexuality and gender is maybe 30% of the time. I feel like I have a guest on talking about that. Talk a lot about race and so on. And I love your point about the for good or for ill, the influence of the West on the world. I would say in this conversation too, there's other cultures that are actually further ahead, or a trans-related identity has been at home in that culture for many years. I mean, I know in Thailand and Southeast Asia, Philippines, even South Pacific. I think Latin America. I've never been to South America, but I think Brazil. I don't think this is a yet to come conversation. I think it's very much something that Christians there are wrestling with. I think India or Nepal might have been the first country to recognize a third sex or gender on their passport or whatever. So this is many sexuality conversations are kind of the West is kind of the ones kind of out in the head of culture. But I think when it comes to gender and trans related conversations, cultures have been kind of all over the place on that. So very relevant for anybody.
So good. Well, Preston, appreciate you so much, man. Thank you for being on the show. This is helpful. I love your book, man. I love reading it. And also I just want to, I guess, man, I never want to end, but I do want to end on this. As my first experience listening to an audiobook, it was so great that it was actually you reading the book. I'm like, this is cool, man. It was almost like listening to a podcast, like I said, for like 5 hours or so. But so good, man. So good. Highly recommend to people. Preston, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, bro.
Bye.
La speranza è il futuro.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Christian Podcast. If you liked this episode, share it with friends and family. Make sure you subscribe and leave a positive review wherever you can. You can also visit christianpodcast.com to learn more about our show. Hasta la vista.